Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, finally, we're going to be talking about the newest album from the Wombats, titled Glitterbug. You know, it's one of the weirdest things about music throughout the years, and something that the more you think about it, just makes less and less sense. And it's how power pop just isn't really all that successful on mainstream radio, at least nowadays. I mean, sure, you might get the occasional hit from bands with enough of an edge to really rock out, but a penchant for more of the strong, sticky hooks that pop music needs to have radio success, but they seldom stick around, even in years when you would think they would do well. Take the pop rock boom in the mid-2000s, the heyday of Fall Out Boy and Jimmy Eat World and My Chemical Romance and Green Day and a host of imitators. You'd think that mainstream radio would have been desperate to snatch up more bands that are willing to take fast-paced, guitar-driven rock music and pair it with a more polished pop package. But success for these bands tended to be limited, especially if the band had a quirky, indie sort of edge that hadn't yet become as popular as it is, say, nowadays. Such was the case for the Wombats, a Liverpool-based indie band that broke out with their debut album, A Guide to Love, Loss, and Desperation. Like many of the indie acts of that time, you could see very much the lineage of their sound. The jangly production and overwritten lyrics, very reminiscent of the Arctic Monkeys, crossed the warped, jagged, and yet oddly theatrical styling that recalled a lot of Modest Mouse and Franz Ferdinand, especially with the frenetic drumming and the bass harmonies. But the Wombats really stood out against all of those bands, at least for me, mostly because frontman Matthew Murphy was able to convey an air of sheer panic so well to match lyrics drenched in over-detailed working-class heartbreak, and he wasn't afraid to toss in some lightweight backing harmonies to cut the sting in the lyrics a little bit. It helped that the band had a really solid sense of humor and an idea of their own scope. The topics were pure pop idealism, and they worked to build off that with a lot of details, and that made themselves one of the most intensely listenable and genuinely fun albums of 2007. Seriously, go check it out if you haven't. It's awesome. Unfortunately, it wasn't a formula that seemed destined to last. 4 years later, they dropped This Modern Glitch, and while the idealism and most of the energy was still there, it just wasn't quite the same. The writing didn't seem as sharp, the energy was less ruckus and wild, and while the addition of synthesizers worked well enough in a way that was very reminiscent of the Killers, I couldn't help but feel that the Wombats didn't need to become a cleaner or more polished band, no matter how much some of the guitars managed to really snarl. Some could argue that that album was a sellout move, except it didn't take them any further towards the mainstream, so there's that. So when I heard that not only was the band staying with that direction or even going further, but even losing some of their trademark sense of humor, I had a real bad feeling about this album. I mean, would Glitterbug end up being the album that breaks the Wombats into the mainstream, but at the cost of what made them really special? Well, let me start by reassuring all of you that the Wombats didn't quite go in that direction. In fact, if we're looking for an album that finds a much more of a happy medium between the wild and weird exuberance and a little bit more maturity, it would come here with Glitterbug. And what's all the stranger is that it did so by taking a step in playing towards the band's strengths in songwriting and self-aware framing. And even while it does have the most traditionally conventional sound and presentation of their albums to date in terms of the modern indie rock that's popular now, it knows it and it's planning to exploit it for all it's worth. So yeah, you can bet I enjoyed the hell out of this album. Even though I would argue it's not exactly a classic or all that much better than their debut, it is still great though. You know what? Here's the funny thing. It's still very recognizably a Wombats record. Well, it's because the fundamental strengths of the Wombats haven't exactly changed, even despite the glossier, more synth and reverb-heavy production courtesy of Bastille producer Mark Crew. It still maintains a lot of the elements that work shockingly well beyond that. The Wombats have always had great subtle bass melodies and energetic and eclectic drum patterns. So even as the guitars are crushed further back, the bass can have melodic interplay with the synthesizers that's both prominent and energetic. If anything, the greater focus on groove with this production emphasizes this, from the rubbery bass lines on Emoticons, to the incredibly bouncy groove on Give Me a Try, to the strikingly sharp kick drums on Be Your Shadow, to the incredible tightness of the bass line on This Is Not a Party, or the thicker guitars of Your Body Is a Weapon. And while I could easily draw a line from mid to late 80s inspired synth pop to this record, especially with the Phil Collins inspired drum breakdowns that pepper the mix all over this album, it's hard to complain when the grooves are this good and the synths add all sorts of gleaming presence that I do like. Granted, the mix balancing isn't perfect. If we're looking for the element that suffers here most in this album, it's the guitar solos, as almost all of them are crushed midway to the back of the mix or given tones that are either compressed too heavily or just completely unflattering, like on Emoticons or Your Body Is a Weapon. But even with that, there are more rough edges that lurk around the edges, or even moments like the XTC like chorus chorus switch up on Headspace, or that fantastic bridge swell on Curveballs that show the band hasn't lost their off-kilter flavor that I loved in the first place. In other words, they've got their weirder moments with a more conventional sound, and they pull it off. And really, those late 80s influences are unmistakable, especially harkening back to the heady rush of ecstasy-fueled rave culture in the UK in the late 80s. They're also very much intentional, which ties directly into the lyrics and themes of the album, which can really be split into two distinctive arcs on this record. The first is the heady, swirling, drug-fueled immersion into that party. And even as our protagonist knows the rush is unsustainable, probably not healthy, and the girl he's doing it all with is using and abusing him, he's not gonna walk away from it on some level because it's everything he's wanted, and it's a ton of fun. Hell, he begins the album with the impetus to dump her because of the emotional distance he feels, but instead he sinks all the deeper into it, yet observant enough to realize and notice how much everyone else is trying to make it work too, very much like him, faking it with such desperation that they're almost seeing it, like going, this is not a party. The second half of this album is when reality actually hits, with the realization from our protagonist that he just can't do it in the same way anymore, especially as his emotional distance from his girl and their growing incompatibility becomes more clear, which prompts her to cheat on him and for him to finally walk away. And that midpoint is very sharply defined on Isabel, one of the most well-written songs on this album, and the point where he finally realizes what this life is doing to the both of them. And yet, that song's a love ballad, only tinged with the regret and the delivery that just does wonders here. Now, you could easily argue that the girl on this album could be representative of the music industry or the nebulous mainstream audience that has never really quite embraced the Wombats. And you know what? As a brand of pop satire in the vein of an act like Kesha, it actually works surprisingly well. But I make the case the album has viability both ways. It's not like the lyrics aren't very still much witty or sharp, although I will say I do miss the incredibly detailed writing of that first album that painted such a vivid and memorable picture. But going for that additional level of abstraction, no matter how often it's implied, does distance the audience a bit from the more intimate moments. So if you want the sound to be just about a girl, it can work in that vein. But here's the element that brings it all together and really does set the Wombats apart startlingly well and make this album really awesome. Matthew Murphy's vocals. Quite simply, without him, this album would not work because you lose that sense of frantic, self-aware desperation that gives the Wombats so much energy and earnest power. I mean, sure, the framing helps, setting up exactly why our protagonist would want to re-enter a bad situation, even despite knowing that for all of its intoxicating atmosphere, it's a really bad idea. But Murphy's delivery manages that razor-thin balance in humanizing his story and keeping himself within it. Hell, he could very easily look down on all these people for being in the same straits, which incidentally is the very issue I have with most of Arctic Monkeys' songs, but there really isn't cynicism here, no matter how much he would have good reason to be cynical. Hell, the one moment where he comes close to that line, it's Pink Lemonade, and his exasperation comes there across more as hapless than really biting. Quite simply, while he might be one of the smartest guys in the room at the moment, he's just as confused and emotionally desperate as everybody else. Murphy really can sell that. Now, some might argue that Murphy's relationship, in the way that he describes it, it's damn close to abusive or exploitative, could be used here as a cheap way to garner sympathy and pity for the guys just as an underdog. But there's two major counterpoints to this. The first being that Murphy does a terrific job selling that giddy rush of love for all the wrong reasons. And secondly, when he does come back to Earth, he leaves this girl and moves on with his life, probably for better things. So let's put it another way. If Bleacher's Strange Desire told this same sort of story with a similar arc and themes using the sweeping bombast of the mid-80s, the Wombats' Glitterbug tells the story in the spaced-out giddy rush of the very late 80s, and I'd argue it's nearly as good. Incredibly tight with terrific melodic grooves balanced against the melodies, to say nothing of smart, well-framed lyrics and a great performance. This album was a ton of fun and easily earns an 8 out of 10 for me. And it's proof, for as much retro-leaning synth-pop as there is that saturates the market right now, there is still a place for those who do it incredibly well, and the Wombats, they pulled it off. Check this out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Seriously, what did you guys think of it? You think they pulled it off as well as I do? Because man, I enjoyed the hell out of this record. But if there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, and any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.